The cool breeze of early autumn rustled through the trees as Michael sat outside his favorite local coffee shop, sketchbook open but mind wandering. The cafe, a popular spot among the locals, buzzed with the usual morning crowd, a symphony of clinks, chatter, and the espresso machine's steady hiss. Michael glanced up as the door chimed, heralding the entrance of someone entirely out of the ordinary. The figure paused, surveying the room with a curious gaze, a tall, slender form with an angular face and luminous eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The newcomer's attire was simple yet oddly elegant, a seamless blend that somehow set him apart from everyone else. Curiosity piqued, Michael watched as the alien, because who else could it be with such an ethereal presence, approached the counter, speaking softly to the barista. The staff member's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and intrigue, as they nodded and began preparing a drink. Deciding that artists needed to seize inspiration wherever it appeared, Michael closed his sketchbook and made his way over. "First time here?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. The alien turned, a smile breaking across his features. "Yes, it is my first time on Earth as well. I'm Cale." "Michael," he replied, extending a hand, intrigued by Cale's formal yet warm tone. "What brings you to our little part of the world?" "I'm here to study," Cale explained, taking the offered hand. His grip was firm yet strangely light. "Human culture is quite renowned for its diversity and emotional expression. I'm an anthropologist." "That's fascinating," Michael said, genuinely interested. "You'll find no shortage of subjects here. Everyone in this town has a story." Cale's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "And what about you? What is your story?" "I'm an artist," Michael said, with a gesture towards his sketchbook. "I try to capture people's stories without words." "That sounds like a valuable skill," Cale observed, collecting his drink, a plain, black coffee, from the barista. "Care to join me?" Michael gestured towards his table. "You can tell me about where you're from, and I can provide a local's perspective. Maybe even capture your portrait." Cale nodded, the corners of his eyes crinkling in what Michael interpreted as delight. As they settled down at the table, Michael couldn't help but think about how unusual this meeting was. He was sitting with someone from another world, yet it felt as natural as any conversation with an old friend. "So, Cale, what's the most surprising thing you found about Earth so far?" Michael asked as he reopened his sketchbook. Cale thought for a moment, sipping his coffee with careful consideration. "I think it's the way the Earth smells," he finally said. "It's so vibrant and ever-changing. My world doesn't have such variability in its environment." Michael chuckled. "Wait until you experience autumn in full swing. The colors, the scents, it's like the world turns into a canvas." "I am eager to see it," Cale replied, his tone filled with a learner's enthusiasm. "And I am equally eager to learn from you, Michael. How do you capture such transience in your art?" "Well," Michael started, his fingers poised with a pencil over the paper, "let me show you." As he began to sketch, the morning unfolded around them, the cafe's hustle dimming into a backdrop for a meeting that felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Chapter 2. The Encounter. The gallery was buzzing with excitement as artists and art enthusiasts mingled under the warm glow of elegant lighting. Canvases adorned the walls, each telling a different story, beckoning the viewers to lose themselves in vivid colors and intricate patterns. Michael, his artist's eye ever scanning, was explaining a particularly mesmerizing piece to Cale, who listened intently, absorbing every detail. "This artist uses light and shadow to play with perception," Michael noted, pointing to the subtle shifts in the painting's hues. "It's almost like she wants the viewer to step into the canvas." Cale nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of fascination and deep thought. "It's remarkable. On my planet, art is more about symmetry and order. This feels alive, like it could change the moment you look away." "It's the human touch," Michael replied with a smile. "Imperfection makes it feel real." As they moved to the next piece, they were joined by Thomas, another local artist and a good friend of Michael. Thomas's work was known for its bold strokes and evocative themes. "Michael, glad you could make it." Thomas greeted them with a hearty handshake. "And who's this?" "This is Cale, an anthropologist from another world," Michael introduced. "He's here studying human culture." Thomas's eyebrows rose, his interest clearly piqued. "Is that so? What do you make of our little artistic gathering then, Cale?" "It's incredibly inspiring," Cale replied earnestly. "I'm amazed at how art here is not just seen but felt. It engages senses I didn't know needed engaging." "Wait until you see my latest piece," Thomas said with a grin, leading them through the crowd to a secluded corner of the gallery where a large, covered canvas awaited. "I'd love to get your take on it, Cale." "From an alien perspective." With a dramatic flourish, Thomas pulled the cover off, revealing an abstract explosion of colors that seemed to pulse with hidden life. "It's about chaos and order," Thomas explained, "the push and pull of life's unpredictability." Cale stepped closer, tilting his head. "It's chaotic, yes, but there's rhythm here," he observed, tracing the air along the swirls. "Like the chaos is part of a larger pattern." "Exactly," Thomas exclaimed, delighted. "Most folks just see the mess. But it's about finding the order in the chaos, the pattern in the mess." Cale and Thomas discussed the concept further, with Michael chiming in occasionally, pointing out similarities in human and alien perceptions of aesthetics. As the evening wore on, the trio found a quiet spot to sit and reflect. Drinks in hand, they continued their conversation about art, life, and the universe. "So, Cale, has anything else about Earth surprised you?" Thomas asked, his tone friendly and curious. "Your music," Cale answered without hesitation. "It's not just heard, it's experienced. It resonates on an emotional level that is quite new to me." "That's humanity for you," Michael added. "We live and breathe through our art, whether it's visual or musical." The discussion gently shifted to the topic of music, with Thomas suggesting a visit to a jazz club. "You should experience it live. There's nothing quite like jazz to make you feel the spectrum of human emotions." "I would like that very much," Cale said, his voice infused with anticipation. "It seems there is much more to learn and feel here." As the night concluded, the three parted ways with plans to meet again soon, the beginnings of a profound friendship forged between worlds, bonded over the universal language of art. Chapter 3. A Gesture of Friendship. On a crisp Saturday morning, Michael led Cale through the bustling streets of the downtown market. The air was filled with the aromas of fresh pastries, roasting coffee, and the tangy scent of seasonal fruits. Stalls lined the streets, each vendor displaying their wares with proud, inviting gestures. "Markets are the perfect place to experience the essence of human culture," Michael explained as they navigated through the crowd. "It's not just about buying and selling. It's about community, sharing, and interaction." Cale observed everything with an eager intensity, his eyes darting from one stall to another. "It's very lively," he remarked, a slight smile playing on his lips. "People seem to connect on a basic level here, over the exchange of goods and food." "That's the heart of it," Michael agreed. They stopped by a stall laden with freshly baked bread and pastries. "Try one of these," he suggested, picking up a golden-brown croissant and handing it to Cale. As Cale tasted the flaky pastry, his expression brightened. "This is excellent. I can taste the care and skill that went into making it." Michael chuckled. "Wait until you try the coffee here." He led Cale to a popular coffee cart known for its rich blends. As they stood in line, Michael noticed a familiar face approaching them. "Hey, Michael, out for your weekend treat?" the newcomer greeted with a warm smile. He was a middle-aged man, known to many in the community as Uncle Joe, who ran a local diner. "Hey, Uncle Joe," Michael greeted him back. "I'd like you to meet Cale. He's visiting from far away." He hinted at the sky with a playful glance. "Nice to meet you, Cale." Uncle Joe extended his hand, which Cale shook gently. "Any friend of Michael's is a friend of mine. What do you think of our little market?" "It's wonderful," Cale responded. "There's a richness to the interactions here that I find very intriguing." "Glad you think so," Uncle Joe exclaimed. "You boys must come by the diner sometime. I'll cook something special for you." "We'd love that," Michael replied, receiving their coffees from the cart. They thanked Uncle Joe and made their way to a nearby bench. Sitting down with their coffees, they watched the world go by. "People here seem to open up easily," Cale noted. "They share a part of their lives with strangers." "It's all about trust and community," Michael sipped his coffee. "You share a bit of yourself, and you gain more in return." Their conversation drifted to various topics, from human expressions of art to the social structures on Cale's planet. Cale was particularly interested in the informal way humans formed and maintained relationships. As the market began to wind down, Michael suggested a walk by the riverside. "There's a peace there that contrasts nicely with the market's energy," he said. Walking along the river, Cale seemed contemplative. "I'm starting to understand why you value your art and culture so highly. They are not just about aesthetics or economy. They're about building and maintaining the fabric of your society." "Exactly," Michael nodded. "Art, music, even this market, they're threads in the same fabric. Pull one, and you'll feel the effect somewhere else." Cale paused, looking out over the water. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It's giving me much to think about." Michael smiled, placing a friendly hand on Cale's shoulder. "That's what friends are for. To show each other new perspectives." As they returned to the heart of the city, the day's experiences had woven a new layer into their growing friendship, enriching Cale's study with first-hand experiences of the vibrant, intricate tapestry of human life. Chapter 4: Cultural Exchange. Later that week, Michael invited Cale to his studio, a cozy, cluttered space filled with canvases, paintbrushes, and an eclectic mix of music playing softly in the background. The studio was a true reflection of Michael's creative spirit, with every inch utilized to inspire or store his artistic endeavors. "Welcome to my sanctuary," Michael grinned, leading Cale inside. "This is where all the magic happens." Cale looked around with wide eyes, absorbing the myriad details. "It's fascinating," he observed. "Every corner tells a story." "That's the idea," Michael said, picking up a half-finished canvas. "Art is about storytelling, about capturing emotions and moments. But enough about my world. Today, I thought you might share more about yours. Maybe even teach me something from your planet's art forms." Cale's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I'd love to. On my planet, we use a technique called helix weaving. It's both a physical and a metaphysical form of art." Intrigued, Michael cleared a space on his work table. "Show me." Cale pulled a small device from his bag, which projected a three-dimensional grid into the air. "We start with a framework like this," he explained. "Each intersection can be manipulated to alter not just the shape, but also the energy flow through the art." "Energy flow?" Michael was fascinated. "Yes, it's believed that art can influence emotions not just through visual aesthetics but through subtle energy currents that interact with our own." Cale manipulated the grid, and the pattern shifted, its colors changing subtly. Michael, always eager to try new techniques, watched intently, then attempted to interact with the grid himself. "Like this?" he asked, touching a node, and the grid rippled with a burst of color. "Exactly." Cale was pleased. "You're a natural." They spent the afternoon experimenting with helix weaving, Cale explaining more about his culture's use of art as a tool for emotional and communal harmony. Michael, in turn, shared his approach to painting, emphasizing emotional conveyance through color and form. "Your turn," Cale said after a while, handing Michael a set of brushes. "How would you capture this experience?" Michael thought for a moment, then began to paint. His strokes were bold and confident, translating the alien art form into a visual representation that felt both foreign and familiar. As they worked, the two discussed the similarities and differences in their artistic visions and philosophies. "It's amazing," Michael mused, stepping back to view his work. Two completely different approaches, yet they aim to achieve the same end: Connection, understanding, expression. Cale nodded, looking at the painting. Perhaps that's what all sentient beings share, a desire to connect, to understand. As the day turned into evening, Michael turned down the lights and lit a few candles, changing the ambience. "Art by candlelight," he announced. "Something to eat, perhaps?" He brought out some simple snacks, cheese, crackers, and some fruit, while Cale continued to manipulate the light grid, now casting intricate shadows on the walls. "This exchange has been enlightening," Cale said, his voice soft in the dim light. "I feel as though I'm not just learning about human culture, but about the potential for unity in diversity." "Likewise," Michael agreed, raising his glass in a toast. "To new friendships and new understandings." They clinked glasses, the sound crisp in the quiet room, surrounded by the products of their shared creativity. The evening ended with plans to explore each other's worlds further, both eager to continue their cultural and artistic exchange. Chapter 5. The First Touch. The season had shifted subtly towards winter, and the crispness of the air was now unmistakable. Michael had invited Cale to join him on a visit to the city's botanical gardens, a place where the chill of the season was held at bay within the lush, warm confines of the greenhouse. As they walked among exotic plants and vibrant flowers, the atmosphere around them felt almost otherworldly. The humidity inside the greenhouse fogged up the windows, creating a natural barrier that made the outside world seem distant and muted. "So, what do you think?" Michael asked, his breath slightly visible in the warm air. "It's like stepping into a different part of the planet altogether." "It's beautiful," Cale responded, his eyes roaming over the flora. "These plants, are they all from Earth?" "Mostly, yes. Some are hybrids, but they all originated here. It's a way of preserving species that might otherwise be lost to colder seasons," Michael explained, leading Cale to a particularly lush fern grotto. Cale reached out to touch a fern, his hand hesitating just before the fronds. "May I?" "Of course," Michael encouraged with a nod. As Cale's fingers made contact with the plant, the tips of the fern seemed to respond, curling slightly towards his touch. It was a small, nearly imperceptible movement, but Michael caught it. "Looks like it likes you," he joked lightly. Cale smiled, withdrawing his hand slowly. "It's fascinating how responsive life is." They continued their walk in companionable silence until they reached a secluded spot with a small pond, where water lilies floated gently on the surface. Sitting on a nearby bench, they watched a few late-season butterflies flit among the flowers. "It's peaceful here," Cale remarked, his voice soft, reflective. "On my planet, we have simulations of environments, but nothing this tactile. I find that real experiences have a texture that simulations can't replicate," Michael said, turning to look at Cale. Their eyes met, and something in the moment felt significant, a shared understanding that resonated deeper than words. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the greenhouse or the quiet around them, but Michael felt compelled to reach out. He placed his hand over Cale's, an offer of comfort and connection. The touch was gentle, exploratory, respecting the boundaries yet seeking closeness. Cale looked down at their hands, then back up at Michael. His expression was unreadable for a moment before a warm acceptance spread across his features. He turned his hand under Michael's, their fingers intertwining. "This is new," Cale murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "For me too," Michael admitted, his heart beating a little faster. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" "It does," Cale agreed, squeezing Michael's hand slightly. The simple act felt loaded with meaning, an acknowledgment of the bond that was forming between them, something neither had anticipated but both seemed willing to explore. They sat together like that for a while, neither moving to break the contact. Around them, the greenhouse lived its own slow, serene life, oblivious to the human and alien experiencing a moment of quiet revelation. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice low and filled with a new-found affection. "Let's stay a bit longer." "There's no rush, is there?" "No rush at all," Cale replied, and they remained seated, hands clasped, as the light shifted and the garden settled into twilight. Chapter 6. The Embrace. As the weeks turned into months, Michael and Cale's relationship deepened, founded on mutual curiosity and a profound respect for each other's cultures. They had spent countless hours discussing everything from art to philosophy, each meeting enhancing their bond. One cool evening, Michael invited Cale to his apartment for a private dinner. He wanted to share something more personal, his cooking, a hobby he rarely shared with others. The apartment was warmly lit, with soft jazz music playing in the background, setting a relaxing ambience. "Smells wonderful," Cale commented as he entered, his eyes taking in the modest, art-filled living space. "I hope you like pasta," Michael said with a slight nervousness in his voice. "It's nothing fancy, just something I picked up from my grandmother." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed as easily as the wine Michael poured. They laughed and shared stories, the meal stretching into hours. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Michael had set up his easel. "I want to show you something," he said, uncovering a painting he had been working on. It was a portrait of Cale, capturing him in a moment of laughter, his eyes sparkling with life. Cale was touched. "Michael, it's beautiful. You've really seen me, haven't you?" "I've tried," Michael replied, his cheeks coloring slightly. "I wanted to capture you as I see you. Joyful, intelligent, fascinating." Cale stepped closer, his gaze intense and full of emotion. "And I see you, Michael. Your talent, your kindness, the way you bring light into a room." The air between them was charged with an electric current of unspoken feelings. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Cale reached out to touch the side of Michael's face. It was a tender gesture, one that spoke volumes. Michael turned his face into the touch, closing his eyes for a moment to savor the contact. When he opened them again, Cale was closer, their faces only inches apart. The music in the background seemed to swell as if sensing the moment's importance. "May I?" Cale asked softly, a question that held more weight than just the permission to bridge the gap between them. "Yes," Michael whispered back, and that single word was all the consent Cale needed. Their first kiss was gentle, exploratory, as if both were trying to memorize the feel of it. Michael's hands found their way to Cale's waist, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss. Cale responded in kind, his arms wrapping around Michael, strong yet careful. When they finally parted, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "This feels like where I meant to be," Cale confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Me too," Michael agreed, his heart full. "Right here, with you." They spent the rest of the evening wrapped in each other's arms, talking, kissing, and simply enjoying the feeling of being together. It was a night of many firsts, each moment cherished and stored in the treasure chest of their memories. As Cale finally drifted off to sleep on Michael's couch, wrapped in a warm blanket and Michael's arm around him, he realized that Earth had become more than just a place of study. It had become a home, a place where he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. And Michael, watching Cale sleep, felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. Here, in his embrace, was a connection that transcended worlds, a bond that was uniquely theirs. It was new, it was thrilling, and it was something he never wanted to let go. Chapter 7. Bound by Love. Several weeks had passed since that transformative night, and the bond between Michael and Cale had grown even stronger. They spent every possible moment together, exploring each other's worlds and delving deeper into their shared experiences. On a particularly serene Saturday, Michael decided to take Cale to a quiet, secluded beach he often visited when seeking inspiration. As they walked along the shoreline, the gentle sound of waves lapping against the sand provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "I've been thinking," Michael began, his voice thoughtful against the rhythmic sounds of the sea, "about how much you've shown me. Not just about your culture, but about seeing things in new ways." Cale smiled, turning to face him. "And I've learned so much about emotion, about depth of feeling from you. It's something we understand, but not to the extent that humans experience it." They found a spot near the edge of the water, where driftwood and smooth stones dotted the sand. Sitting down, They watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. "Do you think," Cale asked hesitantly, "that there's a future where our worlds can understand each other as we do?" Michael reached out, taking Cale's hand in his. "I think we're proof that it's possible. Love doesn't acknowledge the boundaries we think are there." Cale nodded, squeezing Michael's hand. "I never expected to find this, to find you. It's changed everything." As the sky darkened, Michael pulled out a small, wrapped object and handed it to Cale. "I made something for you," he said. Cale unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small sculpture, an abstract blend of intertwined forms, one smooth and metallic, the other rough and natural. "It's us," Cale observed, looking up at Michael with a mixture of awe and affection. "Yes," Michael confirmed. "Different materials, different worlds, but together they create something beautiful." "It's perfect," Cale said, his voice laden with emotion. "Thank you, Michael. This means more to me than I can say." They sat together, watching as the last light of day faded into twilight, the sculpture between them a tangible representation of their connection. Later, they built a small fire to ward off the chill of the night air, their conversation drifting to plans for the future. "What will you do when your study here ends?" Michael asked, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his face. Cale looked into the flames, considering. "I was supposed to return, to share what I'd learned. But now," his voice trailed off as he turned to Michael, "I want to stay. With you, if that's what you want too." "It's exactly what I want," Michael replied, his heart swelling with joy and relief. "There's so much more we can learn from each other, so much life to live together." They spent the rest of the evening by the fire, discussing how they would blend their lives, what challenges they might face, and how they would meet them together. It was a night of plans and promises, of dreams shaped by love and a desire to bridge two vastly different worlds. As the fire burned down to embers, Michael and Cale wrapped themselves in a blanket, watching the stars come out. They were so different, one from Earth and one from beyond, yet under the vast sky, they were just two beings bound by love, their hearts beating in unison with the universe's ageless rhythm. Chapter 8. The Future Together. The gentle hum of the city in the early morning was a soundtrack to their new life. Michael and Cale walked hand in hand through the quiet streets, their steps synchronized, each one echoing a promise made under the starlit sky. As they approached a quaint little cafe known for its lively atmosphere and delicious breakfasts, Michael squeezed Cale's hand. "Ready for a new adventure?" "With you." "Always," Cale responded, his tone light with anticipation. They chose a small table outside, the morning air still crisp. As they sat, Michael couldn't help but feel a surge of happiness at the normalcy of it all, just two people enjoying breakfast together, planning their future. "So," Michael started, stirring his coffee, "we need to think about how we're going to manage everything. There's your research, my exhibitions, not to mention the societal implications." Cale nodded, his expression serious. "I've been considering extending my research to include our relationship. It could provide valuable insights into interspecies relations and cultural integration." "That's brilliant," Michael replied, clearly impressed. "It turns our personal journey into something that can benefit others, maybe help ease the way for others like us." "Yes, and I believe it's important that we document everything, not just the cultural aspects, but the personal ones too. It might help in making the case for more open relations between our worlds," Cale suggested, his eyes scanning the horizon as if envisioning the future they were about to forge. Michael reached across the table, touching Cale's hand. "I'm all in. Whatever it takes. And speaking of futures, I've been offered a gallery showing in another city. It's a big opportunity." Cale's smile returned, bright and supportive. "You have to take it. We'll make it work. Distance is trivial when it comes to us." Their breakfast arrived, and as they ate, they continued to discuss logistics, from travel arrangements to communication strategies, all the while laughing and enjoying each other's company. After breakfast, they strolled to a nearby park, a place where Michael often came to sketch. He pulled out a small notebook and handed it to Cale. "I want you to have this. For your thoughts, your observations, anything you feel is important." Cale accepted it with a soft chuckle. "I suppose this makes me an official Earthling, having a notebook for thoughts." "It does," Michael agreed, pulling Cale close for a moment. "You know, this park is one of my favorite places. It's where I come to think, to create. I'd like it to be our place, too." "I'd like that," Cale said, and they spent the next few hours there, talking about their next steps, occasionally sitting in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts but together. As the day grew late, they made their way back through the city, the setting sun casting long shadows ahead of them. They stopped at Michael's apartment, where Cale had slowly been moving in some of his belongings. "Feels like home," Cale noted as he looked around, seeing bits of himself mixed with Michael's decor. "It is home," Michael corrected gently, pulling Cale into an embrace. "Our home." That night, as they lay together, the city lights casting patterns across the ceiling, Michael whispered, "Whatever comes, we face it together. No barriers, no secrets, just us." "And so it shall be," Cale whispered back, his voice steady and sure. They fell asleep entwined, the challenges of the future mere shadows against the light of their bond, their commitment a quiet force promising to withstand any storm. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was theirs, and they would walk it side by side, bound by love, guided by shared dreams and the light of 1,000 stars.